Good morning. My name is Casey Carroll, and I lead the implementation and customer success teams here at Arcadia. I'm excited to be here this morning to talk with you a little bit about how you can prepare and accelerate your implementation onto a data platform. Deciding to invest in a data platform such as Arcadia is a fairly large decision for most organizations. It has financial impacts, it has resourcing and timeline impacts to your organization. So it's important to make sure that you're ready to take on this type of investment. So really, when we think about taking on an implementation of this scope, I really just sort of think of it in two different pillars, sort of the strategic planning aspect of the implementation, as well as the data aspect of the implementation. So when we talk about strategic planning, making sure folks are sort of aligned around why it is that you're even looking to invest in a technology platform, and then you're not going to be successful in your implementation if you don't have the data to sort of create that underlying foundation. So do you have access to that data? So let's get into those topics a little bit. So around aligning on goals and desired outcome, this is one of the things that I think is really very critical when starting off in an implementation, and really when you're going through a sales process and understanding sort of what is your selection criteria going to be, is sort of what does success mean to you? It's sort of what does, and that's a very large question. So we also like to think about boiling that down into what does success look like in 3 months, 6 months, and a year? What do you want to be accomplishing 3 months after you've started your implementation? Sort of what's a realistic goal versus 6 months versus a year, and always sort of be making sure as you're working through that implementation that those are sort of your guiding points, your North Star, sort of are all the things that we're doing, are the decisions that we're making, is the design work that we're doing really tying back into these success criteria that we have created. Does it align with your value-based care contracts? Do you even know what's in your value-based care contracts to know that the goals that you're setting up, do you have the data to support what is within those contracts? So really making sure that you understand what is within your value-based contracts. Do you have the accountability for success metrics? So how are you organized? Are there people who are going to be accountable for this whole project? Are there going to be people who are going to be accountable for bits and pieces of the project, and making sure that they're aligned with what you're trying to do and understand that they are accountable for this area, and that they're bought into the metrics, that have been outlined. And how are you going to assess those goals? So how are you going to be checking back in and saying, hey, are we achieving what we said we wanted to achieve in those 3, 6, 12 months periods? And again, making sure that you're taking the time to go back and sort of check in on that. And again, make any adjustments that you may need to make along the way. In addition to success criteria, people will frequently say sort of, what's the one thing that we can do that's going to make our implementation most successful? Governance really is of critical importance and resourcing. If you don't have the appropriate resources and the appropriate champions in place, the implementation process is going to be very painful. So do you have clinical and operational champions? So do you have people who are bought into this tool, into this process, who are going to be out there and sort of evangelizing what it is that we're doing, how you're partnering, with Arcadia or any vendor to achieve your goals? Physician engagement is absolutely critical. If you don't have some of your physicians or your physician leadership bought in to the tool and the solution and aligned in the goals and success criteria, it's going to be very challenging to get your organization to adopt the software. The folks that you have put in charge, the resources that you have in place, the champions that you have in place, are they able to make quick decisions and move any roadblocks, that are in the way? That can become a huge challenge, as we work through an implementation process. If we don't have people who are empowered to make decisions, empowered to move roadblocks, empowered to sort of get consensus among the group, it's going to slow things down significantly if everything sort of needs to be decided by committee. And if everything needs to be decided by committee, then make sure that you have those committees set up. Have you included stakeholders from all areas? This is very important. One of the things we will spend a lot of time doing in the early parts of an implementation is working with people who have not necessarily been involved in a sales process. And if they haven't been involved in the sales process, they don't know who the vendor is, who Arcadia is, why they've been chosen, what the process is, that we've gone through. So making sure that people understand that. Again, have they been included, in the decision-making process, in the goal-setting process? Again, if you're someone who has a lot of CHCs or practices out in the wild, that you want to be adopting this software, have you made them part of this process? Or they bought in to this process? And then last, but certainly not least, is do you have the project management capabilities to be able to take on such an implementation? I've been doing this for about 25 years, and one of the things I've always said is if you want to identify the areas of dysfunction in your organization, implement a really complex software platform, and you will identify all of the dysfunction within your organization. So making sure that you have a project manager who's going to sort of be able to keep everyone accountable, keep track of tasks, make sure that things are moving forward, be able to pull groups together to come to consensus when consensus needs to be met. And then an adoption strategy. This is really critical. Have you thought about sort of how you want to roll this out? How much data do you need to have integrated before you need to get this out, to the larger population? Do you want to start with a really small core group of analysts who are going to really start pounding on the data and understanding the ins and outs of the functionality before you roll it out to the practices? Do you need to, get a point of care solution out there ASAP, because you're missing gaps every day and you need to get this rolled out? So working with your implementation team to really understand sort of how you want to roll this out, and how you're going to roll this out is really going to be defined by those success criteria, which is sort of the first thing that we had talked about here. So those are really the three pillars within sort of strategic planning: the success criteria, the governance and resourcing, and making sure that you have a solid adoption strategy. One plug I do want to make on the governance and resourcing: at 3 o'clock, our COO and our Senior Director of Implementation are going to be going in depth around governance and setting up governance and all of that good stuff. So I would recommend coming back and hearing that. Yes, back here at 3 o'clock. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about the other side of the implementation. Equally as important, sometimes a little more challenging, is the data aspect. And the only way that you're going to have a successful implementation is if you have a strong data foundation in which to build. So one of the first things when we're talking with prospects, even before we've even been named a vendor of choice, is to start talking to them about data. Do you have access to your data? Do you know what's in your data? More importantly, sometimes, do you know what's not in your data? Do you have access to all of it? Do you know all of the different EHRs that are being used within your organization? Start taking an inventory of all of the different EHRs, and then sort of really understand, where is your patient population? So many times we'll see, we're going to integrate 30 different EHRs. That's wonderful. It's going to take us about 5 years, but let's do it. And you start really breaking it down, and you're like, okay, well, we're going to get, your top 3 payers, and now we've got about 85% of your patient population covered. Do you really want to start going after these other 25 data sources that are going to bring you, 1-2% of your population? Maybe you do. Maybe it's not a big lift for your organization to get that data, get it integrated. Maybe it's a huge lift, and those are the decisions you have to start thinking about. Is it worth going through the pain of sort of integrating this data? Is the output going to be worth it? So really starting to think about some of those things. Or, hey, going back to those goals that you've set and saying, hey, our criteria is to start closing, quality gaps at a greater speed. Okay, well, you know what? We're really going to need some clinical data in order to do that. The claims data is also going to help support that. So, making sure that you're thinking about that while you're thinking about your data. start working with your health plans. Are you even getting health plan data? Is the health plan data you're getting good? What's the frequency at which you're getting that data? Are there large gaps in that data? And start working with them so that when we're ready to start sort of ingesting this data, we'll know what's in it. Because if there are gaps in the data, it doesn't make it unusable. We just need to know that as we're integrating it. So as we're normalizing data, we can understand where those gaps are going to be, and we can understand if there's going to be any gaps in the functionality around that. And then another really important question is, do you have the technical skill set within your own organization to be able to extract the data that is going to be needed in order to get through your implementation? Or is that something that's going to have to be outsourced in order to get that data in-house? And if that has to be outsourced, sort of what is the plan to do that? And then another thing that's really important is going back to understanding what's in your data is we're going to go through a validation process. You're going to go through a validation process with this data. Again, it's so critically important to have someone who understands what does that mean, what's in the data, what are we validating against, so that we can make sure that we always have a source of truth. It's amazing. I'll meet with people who are about to become clients, and it's always like, you have data. Yeah, we have data. We have data. We have data. And then the rubber hits the road, and it's like, great, let's get that data in our hands. And it's like, oh, like, how do we really going to get that data? So really important things to start thinking about early on in the process. And then again, we talked a little bit about this, but scoping and prioritizing your data sources, you're going to have a lot of them. So again, where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? And this is what's going back to making sure that you're setting good success criteria and knowing what your goals are, because that's going to tell you what data you're going to want to integrate first. Do you want to start with clinical data? Do you want to start with, claims data? What are we trying to achieve? Again, how many of these data sources do you actually want to implement? Which ones should we implement first? Do you have any practices who are about to change their EHR? So there's no point in integrating that data because they're changing in 3 months. So really sort of understanding that, being realistic with that data. Again, we've had clients who come in and they're like, in our first wave of our implementation, we want to implement 30 data sources, and not sort of thinking longer term about how are we going to validate 30 data sources? How are we going to sort of really integrate, and what are we going to do with this massive data set? So really being realistic about what you think you can do as an organization to make sure that you're going to be successful. So that is all we have for you today, but I am very happy to take any questions that folks may have. That's a great question. So the question was, when do we work in training to an implementation process? It really is going to depend on the vendor. I can tell you here at Arcadia, our philosophy is that we're going to wait until you have actual data integrated and live in a production environment before we do training. And that may sound a little bit like, that seems counterintuitive. We're live and then we get trained. But we have found that it's much more beneficial and much more impactful to train people on their own data. It makes a heck of a lot more sense. I think the other thing that's important to know is that training is not a single instance at Arcadia. It's something that's done over the course of the implementation. We set up different work groups, and there's training within those work groups, making sure that you have the context needed as you're making sort of configuration and design decisions. So training is really something that happens over the course of the whole implementation, but sort of end user point and click functionality training is usually after go live. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So that was a question on how do we help people to understand sort of which data sources they should be integrating and how helpful and impactful that's going to be. And really it's going back to understanding your own patient population and understanding your own goals. Again, if you have 10 different EHRs, but 2 of them cover 80% of your patient population, my recommendation would be you implement those 2 payers first. Where you're starting with claims or clinical data, if you're someone who's going to be really looking at quality and looking to close gaps, you're really going to want both sources on there. You're going to want your clinical data because you're going to get outcomes within that clinical source, but you're also going to want that claims data that's going to tell you, hey, have they had all these tests? What visits, what kind of procedures have they had, which will all be in your claims data. Have they gone elsewhere outside outside of your own network. So it's really going to depend on the organization, what their patient population looks like, and what their goals are, which is why going into that process, it's so critical to sort of understand those things so that then we can work with you to put together an implementation plan that makes sense for you, and that's going to get you to minimal viable product and start getting some benefit and value as early and quickly as possible.